The sky over the Arizona territory wept a venomous cold rain, turning the San Pedro River into a churning beast. It was in this unforgiving torrent that Madeleine Calloway, a woman living on the very edge of civilization, and her own grief found him. He was a ghost, snagged on the roots of a fallen cottonwood, his life bleeding out into the muddy water. She saw the buckskin, the long black hair, the copper skin, and the fresh bullet wound in his side. He was Apache, the very people who had left her a widow and her heart a barren field. Every instinct screamed to leave him to the river's judgment. But another voice, a flicker of the woman she used to be, whispered a more dangerous command save him. She had no way of knowing that the life hanging by a thread in her hands was not just any warrior, but Cochise, the great war chief of the Chiricahua, a man whose death the U.S. Army desired above all else. And by pulling him from the water, she wasn't just saving a man. She was pulling the entire territory into a war that would start on her doorstep. The homestead was a monument to stubbornness. Madeleine Calloway's late husband, Thomas, had built it with his own hands, sinking posts of solid pine into the rocky soil as if challenging the desert to uproot them. For 2 years after his death, the desert had tried. It sent blistering, sun-bone dry winds and the suffocating silence that gnawed at a person's sanity. Now it sent a flood. The San Pedro River, usually a languid ribbon of brown, had swollen its banks, consuming the lower pasture and clawing at the small barn. Madeleine stood on her porch, a double-barreled shotgun resting in the crook of her arm, watching the tempest. The rain fell in sheets, blurring the line between earth and sky. It was a day fit for endings. She saw it first as a tangle of debris, a dark log caught in the skeletal branches of a half-submerged cottonwood. But the log had arms, and hair long and black as a raven's wing, fanned out in the turbulent water. Her blood ran cold. It was a man. Every fiber of her being, honed by 2 years of solitude and fear, screamed at her to go inside, bolt the door, and let the river claim what it held. The territory was no place for sentiment. The only neighbors she had were miles away, and the only law was the one you enforced yourself. But Thomas had been a good man, a man who would have waded into that torrent without a second thought. That thought was a ghost that haunted her, a standard she could no longer meet. Cursing her own conscience, she pulled on a heavy oilskin coat, grabbed a length of rope from the barn, and made her way toward the raging water's edge. The ground sucked at her boots. The closer she got, the clearer the details became. He wore beaded buckskin leggings, torn and muddied. A quiver of arrows was still strapped to his back, though most were likely lost. He was Apache. The word hit her like a physical blow. The face of the man who had led the raid on the Butterfield stage, the raid that had taken Thomas, flashed in her mind. It was a face she'd constructed from nightmares, harsh lines, cruel eyes, a mouth twisted in a yell. This man in the water was unconscious, his face slack and unnervingly young, but he was one of them, the enemy. For a long moment she stood frozen, the rain plastering her hair to her face, the rope limp in her hand. Let him die. The thought was sharp and ugly. It would be justice. One less raider, one less threat to settlers like her. It was the law of the land, unspoken, but understood them or us. But then the man's head lolled to the side with a surge of the current, and she saw the wound. It was a clean, dark hole, high on his ribs, oozing a sluggish stream of blood that the river greedily stole. A bullet wound. Not a fall, not an accident. He was hunted. Something shifted in her. This wasn't a faceless warrior in the heat of battle. This was a dying man, helpless as a newborn kitten. To leave him now felt less like justice and more like murder. With a strangled sob of frustration and fury at herself, at him, at the whole damned world, she tied the rope around her waist and secured the other end to the thick trunk of a mesquite tree. She waded in. The cold was a shock that stole her breath. The current was a living thing, a muscular beast that shoved and pulled, trying to drag her downstream. It took all her strength to fight her way to the cottonwood. Her boots found no purchase on the slick, submerged ground. She grabbed onto a branch, the bark scraping her palms raw. He was heavier than he looked, all lean, muscle and bone. Getting the rope around his chest was a desperate struggle. His body was limp, an anchor in the raging water. He was still breathing, the exhalations shallow and ragged. She worked frantically, her fingers numb her mind, a blank slate of pure animalistic effort. Hauling him back to shore was a new kind of hell. She didn't pull so much as scramble backwards, using the rope tied to the tree as her guide, letting the current do half the work while she kept his head above water. Twice her feet slipped, and she went under swallowing gritty water and panicking in the brown, churning chaos before her anchor rope snapped her back to reality. Finally, she dragged him onto the muddy bank, collapsing beside him, gasping for air, her lungs burning. He lay still, a broken figure, cast up by the storm. For a moment, she thought her effort had been for nothing, that he was already gone. She pressed 2 trembling fingers against his neck. A faint, thready pulse fluttered against her skin. He was alive. The realization brought no relief, only a fresh wave of dread. What in God's name had she done? Dragging him the 50 yards to her cabin was a grueling, undignified affair. She couldn't lift him, so she half-dragged, half-rolled him, his body, leaving a muddy smear across the yard. Inside, she maneuvered him onto the bearskin rug in front of the cold hearth, his wet buckskins pooling water onto the rough-hewn floorboards. She barred the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. The storm raged outside, but inside a different storm was brewing. On her floor lay the embodiment of her deepest fears and hatred. A man she should have killed. A man she had just saved. She stripped off her own soaked coat and stared down at him. In the dim light of the cabin, his features were stark. A strong jaw, a proud aquiline nose, and a wide mouth, now pale. His black hair was plastered to his high cheekbones. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps her own age, near 30. He was not the monster from her nightmares. He was just a man, a wounded, dying man. And he was her burden now. The first 24 hours were a waking nightmare. Madeline worked on autopilot, her actions detached from the maelstrom of her thoughts. Her training, what little she had, came from necessity and old wives' tales. She'd learned from her mother how to set a bone, how to stitch a wound, how to brew teas for fever. She'd never worked on a bullet wound. She'd certainly never worked on an Apache. She cut away the sodden buckskin shirt with a skinning knife, her hands hesitating for a moment over the cold copper skin. His chest was a landscape of old scars and new bruises. The bullet had gone in clean on his right side, just below the ribs. She didn't know if it was still inside him. Probing for it was beyond her skill. She'd likely do more harm than good. The first task was to stop the bleeding and fight the infection. She cleaned the wound with whiskey, the harshest antiseptic she had. The man groaned a low, guttural sound, and his body arched in a spasm of pain. But he didn't wake. His fever was already starting to climb. She moved with a grim efficiency that belied the turmoil in her soul. She boiled water, shredded her own petticoats for bandages, and ground yarrow into a paste, a trick an old trapper had taught her to stanch bleeding. Each touch was a betrayal of her husband's memory. "Thomas, what am I doing?" The question echoed in the silent cabin. But there was no answer, only the howl of the wind and the sick-labored breathing of the man on her floor. He drifted in and out of consciousness, his mind lost in a fevered haze. He muttered words in a language she didn't understand. They were harsh, clipped sounds, sometimes rising to a cry, sometimes sinking to a whisper. In these moments, he was not a fearsome warrior, but a frightened man, lost and in pain. She found herself wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth, an act of tenderness that felt alien and deeply unsettling. By the second day, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and deceptively peaceful. The fever, however, had taken root in her patient. His skin was scorching to the touch, his breathing shallow. He was losing the battle. Madeline knew she was at the limit of her abilities. She needed willow bark for the fever, and her supply was low. She also needed food. Her larder was nearly empty, and the storm had ruined what was left of her garden. She would have to go to town. The thought of leaving him alone was terrifying. What if he woke up lucid and violent? What if he died while she was gone? She looked at the man on her floor. His weapons were gone, lost to the river. He was weak, helpless. The greater danger, she knew, was not what he might do, but what others might do if they found him here. Before leaving, she took a precaution. She moved her heavy oak dining table and wedged its legs against the bedroom door, trapping him inside. It was a flimsy barricade, but it was something. Then she took his knife, a formidable blade she'd found tucked into his leggings, and hid it in the loose stone of the hearth. Lastly, she took her own rifle. She propped it by the front door, a stark reminder of the fragile peace within her home. The ride to Redemption Creek was 5 miles of nerve-wracking tension. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like a cry. Redemption Creek wasn't much of a town, a single dusty street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and the sheriff's office. It was a place built on suspicion, where newcomers were eyed with distrust, and gossip traveled faster than a prairie fire. She tied her horse, Bess, in front of Miller's general store, pulling her bonnet low to hide her face. She felt as though her secret was branded on her forehead. Mr. Miller, a portly man with a perpetually worried expression, greeted her with a nod. Mrs. Calloway. Nasty storm. Thought it might wash you clear away. It tried, Mr. Miller, she said, her voice strained. I need supplies, flour salt coffee, and any willow bark you have. He raised a bushy eyebrow. Fever. A touch, she lied, her heart pounding. The dampness gets in the bones. As he gathered her items, the door swung open, and 2 men entered, their spurs jingling. One was Deputy Finn, a young man with a chip on his shoulder. The other was Major Gideon Rourke of the United States Army. Rourke was a man carved from granite, with cold, pale eyes and a neatly trimmed mustache that did little to soften his predatory expression. He was the commander of the newly established Fort Grant, and his stated mission was to pacify the territory. Well, look here, Finn, Rourke said, his voice a low drawl that filled the small store. The reclusive widow Calloway. We were just talking about you. Madeline's blood turned to ice. Major, she said, inclining her head slightly. My patrols report a lot of Apache sign up near your claim. Rourke continued, stepping closer. He smelled of leather and tobacco. In fact, we had a skirmish 2 days back, right before the storm hit. We scattered a Chiricahua war party. Wounded their leader, we think. A real devil named Cochise. Madeline focused on a crack in the floorboards, willing her face to remain impassive. Cochise. The name meant nothing to her, but the Major's intensity was terrifying. They vanished in the storm, Rourke said, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. But a wounded man can't go far, especially not with the river like it is. You haven't seen anything unusual, have you, Mrs. Calloway? A stranger? Anyone seeking shelter from the storm?" The lie came easier than she expected. "No one, Major. I bolted my doors and prayed for daylight. I saw nothing but rain." Rourke stared at her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and probing. He was a hunter, and he smelled a scent he didn't quite recognize. "Of course," he said finally, a thin smile touching his lips. "A sensible woman. But keep your eyes open. There's a $50 bounty on any hostile warrior, and 500 on Cochise dead or alive. A woman alone could find that kind of money useful." The veiled threat hung in the air. He knew about her husband. He was reminding her whose side she should be on. "I'll remember that, Major," she said quietly. She paid for her goods, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out the coins. She could feel Rourke's eyes on her back as she left the store. The ride home was a blur of fear. They were actively hunting him. They knew he was wounded, and they were close. She burst into the cabin, her breath catching in her throat. The bedroom door was still barricaded. Everything was as she had left it. She pushed the table aside and cautiously opened the door. He was awake. He had pushed himself into a sitting position, his back against the wall. His eyes, dark and intelligent, were fixed on her. The fever had broken. His gaze was clear and lucid. All the vulnerability she had seen in his delirium was gone, replaced by a guarded, impenetrable pride. They stared at each other across the small room. The patient was gone. In his place sat a warrior, an enemy. He looked from her face to the rifle she still held in her hand. The unspoken truce was over. The question of what came next hung between them, heavy and dangerous as a loaded gun. The standoff in the small bedroom lasted for what felt like an eternity. Madeline's knuckles were white where she gripped her rifle. The man the warrior watched her, his expression unreadable. His gaze was not overtly hostile, but it was intense, ancient, and filled with a kind of weary appraisal that made her feel like a child. He was judging her. Finally she broke the silence, her voice rough. "I am not going to hurt you." He obviously didn't understand the words, but he seemed to grasp the intent. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, his eyes never leaving hers. He was weak, she could see that now. Propping himself up was taking a visible toll. A fine sheen of sweat covered his brow. Slowly, carefully, she backed out of the room, pulling the door partially shut, but not barricading it. It was a gesture of trust or perhaps foolishness. She went to the hearth and began preparing a thin broth from the last of her salted beef and wild onions. Her hands worked, but her mind raced. Major Rourke's words echoed in her ears. Cochise. $500. That much money could buy her a ticket back east, away from this harsh, lonely land that had taken everything from her. It could buy her a new life. All she had to do was ride back to town and tell the Major what was resting in her bed. She ladled the steaming broth into a bowl. Her hand shook, sloshing some onto the floor. She couldn't do it. Betraying a helpless man, even an enemy, for money. It was a line she couldn't cross. It would make her no better than the killers who had ambushed Thomas. With a heavy sigh of resignation, she carried the bowl to the bedroom. He was still sitting up, watching the doorway. She knelt a few feet away from him, placing the bowl on the floor and sliding it toward him. He looked at the bowl, then back at her, his dark eyes filled with suspicion. "It is food," she said, making an eating gesture with her hand. "Eat." He stared at the broth for a long moment before reaching for it with a surprisingly steady hand. He drank it slowly, deliberately, his gaze fixed on her over the rim of the bowl. When he was finished, he set the empty bowl down and spoke for the first time. His voice was a low rasp, but it held a core of strength. "Dîner." He tapped his chest. "Dîner." He then looked at her expectantly. He was telling her what his people called themselves. The people. Madeleine hesitated, then tapped her own chest. Madeleine. He tried the name, his tongue stumbling over the unfamiliar sounds. Madeleine. It was close enough. A tiny, fragile bridge had been built between their two alien worlds. Over the next few days, a strange routine developed. She would bring him food and fresh water and tend to his wound, which to her immense relief was beginning to heal without festering. The yarrow paste had worked. He remained in the bedroom, regaining his strength. They communicated through a clumsy mix of gestures and single words. He learned water and food. She learned the Apache word for thank you, ahe-he. The first time he said it, looking her directly in the eye, it sent a jolt through her. During this time, the whispers from Redemption Creek grew louder. Sheriff Brody paid her a visit a few days after her encounter with Rourke. Brody was a decent man, older with a kind, tired face and a lawman's cautious eyes. He was worried about her. "Madeleine," he said, accepting a cup of coffee at her small kitchen table. "Rourke's got his men crawling all over these hills. He's obsessed with finding this chief Kokis." Madeleine kept her eyes on her coffee cup. He mentioned it. "He's putting the whole territory on edge." Brody sighed, rubbing his temples. "Stirring up the townsfolk. Old Man Hemlock is organizing a militia, which is just an excuse for him and his cronies to get drunk and wave their rifles around. It's a powder keg, Madeleine. Rourke is looking for a spark. I keep to myself, Sheriff. You know that." "I do," Brody said, his gaze softening. "But that's what worries me. You're isolated out here. If trouble comes..." He let the sentence hang. "Rourke was asking questions about you in town, about Thomas, about how a woman alone manages a homestead so close to Apache land." The fear returned cold and sharp. Rourke wasn't just searching the hills, he was searching for weak spots for leverage, and a grieving widow was a prime target. "I manage because I have to," she said, her voice harder than she intended. "I know," Brody said gently. He stood to leave. "Just be careful. Lock your doors. And if you see anything at all, you send word to me. Not to Rourke. To me. Do you understand?" She nodded, unable to speak. The sheriff's warning was clear. He didn't trust the major any more than she did. That night she couldn't sleep. The man in the other room was no longer just a patient. He was a secret. A dangerous secret that could get her killed. Rourke's bounty was a temptation, but his suspicion was a direct threat. Sheriff Brody's visit proved that she was already entangled in this conflict, whether she liked it or not. Driven by a restless anxiety, she lit a lantern and went to the small chest where she kept Thomas's things. She pulled out his locket. Inside was a tiny, faded photograph of him, smiling, his eyes crinkling at the corners. The pain was a dull, familiar ache. She had loved him so fiercely. His death had hollowed her out, leaving behind a shell of the woman she once was. She heard a floorboard creak behind her. She spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. The Apache stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame for support. He had pulled on a spare pair of Thomas's trousers and a shirt she'd left for him. They were too short in the arms and legs, but they covered him. It was the first time she had seen him standing. His eyes were not on her, but on the locket in her hand. He took a hesitant step into the room. She didn't move, her fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a strange curiosity. He stopped a few feet from her and gestured toward the locket. "Husband?" he asked. It was the first English word she'd heard him speak, learned perhaps from her own muttered grief. She nodded, her throat tight. "My husband, Thomas." He looked at the locket, then at her face. His expression was one she could not decipher at first. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, a shared understanding of loss. He said something in his own language, his voice soft. Then he pointed out the window toward the east where the raiders had come from. He made a motion like a horse, riding hard, and then a gesture of finality of life being extinguished. He was asking if this was how Thomas had died. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden. She nodded again, unable to contain the sob that escaped her. "Yes," she whispered. "Apache." The warrior's face hardened, but not with pride or malice. A deep sadness entered his eyes. He looked at her, the grieving widow, and then at himself, the Apache warrior, and for a moment the vast gulf between their peoples seemed to shrink. He saw not a settler, Tor, but a woman in pain, and she saw not a savage, but a man capable of empathy. He reached out not to touch her, but gesturing toward his own chest where his heart would be. He spoke a single word, a name. Coches. The name hit her with the force of a physical blow. The blood drained from her face. Coches, the war chief. The man Major Rourke was hunting. The man with a $500 bounty on his head. The most feared and respected Apache leader in the entire territory. She had saved the man who was, in all likelihood, responsible for the very culture of violence that had led to her husband's death. The irony was so bitter, so profound, it threatened to suffocate her. She stared at the man in her dead husband's clothes, the great war chief, Coches, and realized her life was no longer her own. She was now the guardian of a king, living in the shadow of the gallows. The revelation of his name changed everything. For a full day, Madeleine could barely look at him. Coches. The name was a legend, whispered in fear around settler campfires, and spoken with grudging respect by the soldiers sent to hunt him. He was said to be a brilliant strategist, a phantom who could melt into the mountains, a leader who had united disparate Chiricahua bands against the encroachment of the white man. And he was standing in her kitchen, drinking her coffee. The personal had become political. Her act of mercy was now an act of treason. Harboring a fugitive was one thing. Harboring the U.S. Army's most wanted enemy was a death sentence. Coches seemed to understand the shift in her. He watched her with his unnervingly perceptive gaze, giving her space. He was growing stronger each day. He moved with a quiet grace, exploring the small cabin as if it were a foreign land. He touched the rough-hewn wood of the table, ran a finger over the cool glass of the window pane, and stared for a long time at the cast-iron stove, a marvel of engineering he had likely only ever seen from a distance. One afternoon, desperate to break the suffocating tension, Madeleine took a piece of charcoal from the hearth and a clean piece of pine wood. She drew a crude picture of her cabin, then a winding line for the river. She pointed to the cabin. "Home," she said. Coches watched her, then took the charcoal. His hands, which she knew could wield a knife with deadly precision, moved with surprising artistry. He drew a series of triangular shapes next to her cabin. Mountains, she realized. He pointed to them. "Zill," he said. He then drew a circle with rays coming off it. Sun. A new form of communication opened between them. They spent hours drawing in the dirt floor or on scraps of wood. He showed her the signs for deer, for horse, for enemy. She taught him the words rifle, bread, and rain. It was a slow, painstaking process, a fragile bridge of understanding, built one word, one picture at a time. Through these pictures he began to tell her his story. He drew a gathering of many warriors himself at the center. He drew men in blue coats, soldiers. Then he drew one of his own warriors, separate from the others, speaking to the soldiers. The figure had a distinct feature, a jagged scar drawn across his cheek. Coches pointed to the figure and said a name with utter contempt. Diablo. He then drew the soldiers hiding in a narrow canyon, rifles raised. He drew his own party riding into the canyon unaware. An ambush, a betrayal. He drew himself falling from his horse arrows, pointing to the river. Madeline stared at the crude drawings the story laid bare in the dust. He hadn't been defeated in a fair fight. He had been betrayed by one of his own people, sold to the army. Diablo, the devil. The name was fitting. Her perception of him shifted again. He was not just a warrior fighting for his land. He was a leader who had been stabbed in the back, a king brought low by a traitor. Her animosity, the deep-seated hatred for his people, began to erode, replaced by a complex mix of sympathy and fear. She was caught in the middle of a war she didn't understand, protecting a man whose own people wanted him dead as much as the army did. One evening, a sense of familiarity had settled between them, comfortable enough that she no longer clutched her rifle every time he moved suddenly. She was darning a sock by the firelight, and he was methodically sharpening the skinning knife she had returned to him. The simple domesticity of the scene was so absurd it was almost comical. He stopped his work and looked at the empty space above the hearth where Thomas's hunting rifle had once hung. He gestured to it, then looked at her, a question in his eyes. "Soldiers," she said, understanding his unspoken question. She made the shape of a rifle with her hands, then pointed to herself. She mimed handing it over. "They took it. After Thomas." Coches nodded slowly. He understood the vulnerability of an unarmed person in this land. He looked at her then, a long, searching look. He saw not just the widow but the homesteader, the survivor. He saw the calluses on her hands, the exhaustion in her eyes, the fierce, stubborn set of her jaw. He saw a warrior of a different kind. He rose and went to the small pouch he'd managed to keep, which had been drying by the fire. From it, he pulled a small, intricately beaded object. It was a lizard crafted from turquoise and black beads, sewn onto a piece of soft leather. He held it out to her. "Na shoe," he said. "Lizard." He then made a gesture of protection of a shield deflecting a blow. Madeline knew some of the local lore. For the Apache, the lizard was a symbol of survival and protection. It was a powerful totem, a gift of immense significance. She reached out and took it, her fingers brushing his. The contact was brief, but it sent a shock through her. The beaded lizard was cool and smooth in her palm. It was a gesture of respect, of alliance. He was no longer just her patient, her captive, or her secret. He was her partner in this dangerous game. "Ah, she whispered, using his word for thank you. A faint smile touched his lips, the first she had seen. It transformed his face, chasing away the shadows of pain and suspicion. In that moment, the war, the bounty, and the ghosts of their pasts receded, leaving only two people from different worlds, finding a common language in a small, isolated cabin, bound by a shared desire to simply survive. But survival was a luxury they were about to be denied. Outside in the darkness, the world was closing in. The hunter was about to come knocking on the door. The knock came 2 days later, sharp and authoritative. It was late afternoon, the sun slanting low and casting long shadows across the valley. Madeline's heart hammered against her ribs. Coches, who had been resting, was on his feet in an instant, his movements silent and fluid. He grabbed his knife and melted into the shadows of the bedroom, pulling the door almost completely shut, leaving only a sliver to see through. Madeline took a deep breath, smoothed her apron, and opened the door. Major Gideon Rourke stood on her porch, flanked by Deputy Finn and another soldier. Rourke's smile was thin and devoid of warmth. His pale eyes swept past her, cataloguing the inside of her cabin in a single predatory glance. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice smooth as oiled steel. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Major," she replied, keeping her voice even. "What can I do for you?" "My men and I are conducting a thorough search of the area. We found a trail, a man on foot heading this way from the river. The trail vanished right around your property." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "We thought we would check to ensure you are safe." "I'm perfectly safe, Major. As I told you, I've seen no one." Her palms were sweating. She prayed he couldn't hear the frantic beating of her heart. "Humor me," Rourke said, his smile tightening. He stepped past her into the cabin without waiting for an invitation. Deputy Finn followed, looking uncomfortable. The other soldier remained on the porch. Rourke walked the small space like a wolf circling a trap. He ran a gloved finger along the table, his eyes missing nothing. He noted the 2 coffee cups left to dry by the sink. He saw the faint scuff marks on the floor near the bedroom where she'd dragged the table to barricade the door. His gaze lingered on the bearskin rug where Kokis had first lain, noting it was cleaner than the floor around it. "You live a very tidy life, Mrs. Calloway," he remarked. "Impressive for a woman on her own." "I have little else to do with my time," she said, her voice tight. His eyes fell upon the small beaded lizard resting on the mantelpiece. He picked it up, examining it closely. "An interesting trinket. Indian craftsmanship, unless I'm mistaken. A gift from a grateful friend, perhaps." Madeline's mind raced. "I bought it from a traveling trader months ago, before my husband passed." The lie felt clumsy on her tongue. Rourke didn't look convinced. He set the lizard down and turned his attention to the bedroom door. "My apologies for the intrusion, but a thorough search means being thorough. I'll need to check the other room." This was it. Panic, cold, and absolute seized her. "That's my private bedroom, Major. There is no one in there." "I'm sure there isn't," Rourke said, his voice laced with condescending charm. "It will only take a moment." He started toward the door. Madeline moved to block his path, her body rigid with desperation. "I must insist." Rourke stopped his friendly facade, vanishing in an instant. His eyes turned to chips of ice. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You are aware of the penalties for aiding and abetting a hostile. It's treason. A hanging offense. Are you truly prepared to obstruct a United States Army officer in the execution of his duty for the sake of your privacy?" From the corner of her eye she saw Deputy Finn shift his weight, his hand moving subconsciously closer to the pistol on his hip. He was a follower, and he would follow Rourke's lead. She was trapped. Her defiance would be taken as proof of guilt. She had only one card left to play a desperate, humiliating gamble. She let her shoulders slump, her rigid posture dissolving into one of feminine fragility. Tears, genuine ones, born of terror, welled in her eyes. "Major, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That room it's where I keep my husband's things. It's all I have left of him. I haven't let anyone in there since he died. It's a sanctuary. Please don't." She played the part of the grieving, hysterical widow, a role she despised, but one that Rourke, with his arrogant view of women, might just believe. Rourke stared at her, his expression shifting from suspicion to contemptuous pity. This he could understand. A weak, sentimental woman clinging to the past. It fit his world view perfectly. He glanced at Finn, who looked down at his boots, embarrassed to be witnessing her breakdown. "Very well, Mrs. Calloway," Rourke said with a sigh of theatrical impatience. "There's no need for theatrics. I'm not a monster." He turned away from the door, but as he did, His gaze fell upon the floor. A single dark drop of liquid stained the wood near the bedroom door. Madeline's heart stopped. It was from the broth she had prepared for Coches, which she'd spilled in her haste days ago. She had scrubbed the floor, but a faint stain remained. Rourke bent down, touching the spot with his gloved finger. He sniffed it. Beef broth. He asked, his eyes locking with hers again, the suspicion returning full force. Cooking for one Mrs. Calloway. Before she could answer, a distraction came from outside. The other soldier yelled, "Major, over here!" Rourke straightened up his eyes, still holding hers for a menacing moment, before he turned and strode out the door. Madeline followed her legs, feeling like lead. The soldier was pointing to a set of tracks in the soft earth near the barn, a single set of moccasin prints, partially washed away by the storm, but still visible. They had been made by someone heading away from the homestead toward the mountains. "He was here!" the soldier said, excitement in his voice. "Must have holed up in the barn during the storm and lit out when it broke." Rourke stared at the tracks, then back at the cabin, then at Madeline. He was putting the pieces together, but the tracks were confusing him. Had the Apache been here and already left, or was the widow a better liar than he gave her credit for? He was torn. The evidence was contradictory. The broth stain, the Indian trinket, her strange defiance. It all pointed to her hiding someone, but the tracks pointed away. Madeline knew in a flash of chilling certainty what had happened. Coches, knowing he was a liability, had slipped out during the night to create a false trail, then circled back to the cabin before dawn. He had anticipated this. He was a strategist, even when wounded and trapped. Rourke made his decision. "The trail is fresh enough. He can't have more than a day's start. We're going after him," he barked at his men. He turned back to Madeline, his finger jabbing the air in her direction. "I will be back, Mrs. Calloway," he said, his voice low and venomous. "And if I find that you have lied to me, I will burn this homestead to the ground with you inside it. Mark my words." He mounted his horse, and with his men galloped off in the direction of the false trail. Madeline stood on the porch, shaking uncontrollably until they were out of sight. Only then did she stumble back inside and bolt the door. Coches emerged from the bedroom, his knife still in his hand, his face a grim mask. He looked at her, then pointed toward the mountains where Rourke had gone. He made a sign for a circle indicating his looping path. He had saved them for now, but they both knew it was a temporary reprieve. Rourke was a dog with a scent. He would not be fooled for long. He would be back. Time had run out. Coches had to leave, and he had to leave now. The hunter's departure left a ringing silence in its wake. The immediate danger had passed, but the threat lingered thicker and more suffocating than before. Rourke was not a man to give up. The false trail might buy them a day, maybe two, but he would return, and his suspicion would have hardened into certainty. That night there was a new urgency in the cabin. The unspoken truce had evolved into a desperate alliance. Madeline and Coches sat at the small table, the lantern casting their faces in flickering gold and shadow. He knew he had to leave. She knew she couldn't stay. Using the charcoal again, Coches drew a detailed map in the dust on the floor. He drew the mountains, the Zil, with a familiarity that spoke of a lifetime spent in their embrace. He drew passes and canyons, springs and hidden trails she never knew existed. He drew Rourke's fort, a crude square, and then drew a symbol for his own people's winter camp, hidden deep in a part of the Dragoon Mountains known to the settlers as the Stronghold. He then drew the figure with the scarred cheek again. Diablo. He drew him, leading the blue-coated soldiers not just to the ambush site, but now he indicated toward the stronghold itself, The betrayal was deeper than Coches's own life. Diablo was not just trying to usurp his position, he was planning to lead the army to destroy their people, to wipe them out, while their war chief was presumed dead. Coches looked at her, his eyes burning with a cold fire. This was no longer just about his escape. It was a race to save his nation. "I must warn them," he said, the English words coming out rough but clear. He had been listening, learning more than she realized. A plan began to form between them, pieced together with broken words and gestures. He could not travel during the day. Rourke's patrols would be everywhere. He would have to travel by night using the secret paths he knew. But his wound while healing still pained him. He was not at his full strength. He needed a head start. He needed a distraction. "I can create one," Madeline said, thinking aloud. She looked at her horse. Bess, visible through the window, grazing peacefully in the corral. "Tomorrow morning I will ride to Redemption Creek, but I won't go directly. I'll take the long way through the western scrubland. I'll make it look like I'm heading for the old miners' trail. It leads away from the dragoons. If Rourke has scouts watching my cabin, and he will, they will follow me." Coches watched her, his head tilted in appraisal. He understood the strategy immediately. A feint, a misdirection. He nodded his approval. It was a sound plan, but a dangerous one for her. "They will catch you," he stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Let them," she replied, a grim resolve hardening her voice. "It will take them time. I will feign ignorance, play the frightened widow again. Every hour they spend with me is an hour you gain." It was a terrifying prospect. She would be placing herself willingly into the hands of a man who had threatened to burn her alive. But looking at the determined face of the chief and thinking of the alternative of Rourke returning to find him here, she knew there was no other choice. Her fate was now tied to his. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Madeline packed a small satchel for him, a strip of dried beef, a small pouch of ground corn, and the last of her willow bark. She gave him a dark wool blanket and a full canteen of water. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had. As he was gathering these meager supplies, he paused. He went to the bedroom and returned with the pair of Thomas's old worn trousers he had been wearing. He folded them neatly and placed them on the bed. He then put on his own mud-stained, torn buckskins. It was a gesture of profound respect. He would not go to save his people dressed as his enemy. He would go as Coches of the Chiricahua. Just before dawn, as the sky was turning a soft, pearly grey, it was time. He stood by the cabin door, a tall, imposing silhouette against the nascent light. He was no longer the broken man she had pulled from the river. He was a war chief. His purpose renewed, his spirit unbroken. He turned to her. There were no words left to say that hadn't already been understood. He reached out and gently touched the beaded lizard she had taken to wearing on a leather thong around her neck. A silent reminder of his gratitude, of their bond. Then he did something that surprised her. He reached into his pouch again and brought out something small. He pressed it into her hand. It was a single eagle feather, its base wrapped in red thread. "For the brave," he said softly. He held her gaze for a moment longer, a look of immense respect and shared sorrow passing between them. Then, as silently as a shadow, he slipped out the door and was gone, vanishing into the chaparral. Madeline stood with the feather in her hand, her heart a tangled mess of fear and a strange, fierce pride. She had defied an army, defied her own people, and defied the memory of her own grief to save this man. Now his life and the lives of his people rested on his strength and her deception. She waited until the sun was fully risen, giving him time to put distance between himself and the homestead. She saddled Bess, her movements, deliberate and calm, betraying none of the terror that churned in her stomach. She took one last look at her small, lonely cabin. It had been a prison of her grief, and now it was a sanctuary that had given birth to the most dangerous secret in the territory. She mounted her horse and rode out, not east toward town, but west into the desolate scrubland, a lone rider moving purposefully toward a confrontation she had chosen. She was the bait, and she prayed the hunter would take it. The sun was a merciless anvil. As Madeline rode west, the feeling of being watched a prickle on her neck. She pushed onward for 2 hours, a deliberate, lonely target in the vast scrubland. Finally, 2 riders crested a rise and blocked her path, Deputy Finn and a soldier. "The Major wants a word, Mrs. Calloway," Finn said, his voice tight. There was no room for argument. They escorted her not to her homestead, but to a grim army camp set in the very canyon where Cochise had been ambushed. The sight that greeted her stole her breath. Tied to a juniper tree, his face bruised, and one eye swollen shut, was Sheriff Brodie. Major Gideon Rourke emerged from his tent, slapping a riding crop against his thigh. "A morning ride, Mrs. Calloway," he sneered. "Your little decoy failed. My best scout knows every Apache trick and found the chief's real trail within an hour. It leads straight for the Dragoon Mountains." Rourke's smile was predatory. "He's going to the stronghold, and I have a guide who will take me right to it." From behind a tent, the Apache with the scarred cheek emerged. Diablo. He was not alone. Roped nearby were 2 terrified Apache women and a boy hostages to ensure his loyalty. "The good sheriff here objected to my methods," Rourke said with a cruel glance at Brodie. "So I will ask you one last time. Where is he going?" Madeline's voice was a whisper of pure rage. "Go to hell." "Fine." Rourke snapped, his facade of civility gone. "Burn her homestead. I want nothing left but ashes. When we march, she and the sheriff ride at the front. A human shield. Let's see how brave Cochise is when he has to fire on his friends." As soldiers grabbed her arms, a high, piercing cry echoed from the canyon walls. Every head snapped up. On the rim stood a lone rider, Cochise. Rourke stared, then burst into triumphant laughter. The fool, he came back, for the woman men take him. But before a single rifle was raised, another warrior appeared on the ridge. Then another and another, until the entire canyon rim was lined with dozens of silent Chiricahua warriors, their weapons glinting in the sun. The trap had been sprung, but it was Rourke who was caught. The camp fell deathly silent, the Major's face turning a ghastly white. A single warrior descended into the canyon and confronted Diablo, snapping a broken arrow before him, the ultimate sign of dishonor. Seeing their leader disgraced, Diablo's men immediately abandoned him. Enraged and desperate, Diablo drew a pistol to fire at Cochise, but Sheriff Brodie kicked his legs out from under him. The shot went wild, and 2 of his former allies seized the traitor, dragging him away to face Apache justice. Cochise then raised his rifle. He aimed not at Rourke, but at the ropes binding the hostages. A single perfect shot severed the cord, freeing them. It was a display of utter contempt and superior power, a victory won without a battle. His gaze swept over the humiliated Major, then found Madeline. He looked at her, then at Brodie, and gave a single sharp nod, a final acknowledgement of their alliance, a confirmation of their safety. Then, with a final defiant cry that echoed across the canyon, Cochise and his warriors wheeled their horses and vanished back into the mountains, leaving behind a baffled army, a freed sheriff, and the ashes of Major Rourke's ambition. Madeline stood in the sudden silence, helping Brodie to his feet. She had pulled a dying man from a river, and in doing so had averted a war, quenching the fire on the horizon with an impossible act of compassion. The story of Madeleine Calloway and the war chief Kokais doesn't end with a grand battle, but with something far more powerful, a moment of profound, world-altering choice. It's a testament to the fact that history isn't just shaped by armies and treaties, but by the quiet acts of courage and conscience of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. A woman who had lost everything to hate chose compassion, and in doing so, she didn't just save one man's life. She held the fate of 2 cultures in her hands and chose peace over war, understanding over vengeance. This tale isn't just a relic of the Old West. It's a timeless reminder that our shared humanity can be a bridge across the deepest divides. If this story of incredible bravery and the unlikely bonds that can change the course of history resonated with you, please take a moment to support our channel. Hit that like button to let us know you want more stories like this. Share it with someone who appreciates a powerful narrative. And most importantly, subscribe and ring that bell. You won't want to miss the next chapter we uncover from the annals of the wild and untamed past. Thank you for listening.